It was October 1915, long before the roar of the Blitz or the thunder of Churchill's wartime speeches. Winston Churchill was not yet the Lion of Britain. He was a man standing on the edge of disgrace. The Dardanelles campaign, his grand vision to break the deadlock of the First World War, had failed catastrophically. The shores of Gallipoli were littered with the bodies of thousands of Allied soldiers. The sea that he believed would carry the Royal Navy to victory had instead become a graveyard. Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, had pushed for the operation with fiery conviction. He believed a bold strike through the Dardanelles would open a new front, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and link Britain to its struggling ally Russia. But what began as a strategic gamble quickly descended into one of the most disastrous campaigns in military history. The ships stalled, the landings faltered, and soon the politicians in London began pointing fingers. In the corridors of power, the knives were out. Newspapers turned on him, labeling him reckless and arrogant. Soldiers' families demanded to know why their sons had been sent to die on distant beaches. Churchill, the man of boundless confidence and relentless energy, suddenly found himself isolated. Even his colleagues whispered that his ambition had blinded him. When the Prime Minister, H. Asquith, bowed to pressure and formed a coalition government, Churchill was pushed aside. He was stripped of his Admiralty post, the very seat of his influence, and handed a powerless title, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. It was, in effect, exile within his own government. As he left the Admiralty offices, witnesses say Churchill's eyes glistened with tears. He had been humiliated before the nation. His great gamble had cost him everything: his reputation, his authority, and nearly his career. But for Churchill, this was not the end. It was the beginning of his transformation, the fire that would one day forge the leader Britain would desperately need. The aftermath of Gallipoli haunted Churchill like a specter. Every newspaper headline seemed to sneer at his failure. Every whisper in Parliament carried the sting of betrayal. His political enemies rejoiced. His friends kept their distance, and the once brilliant voice of the Admiralty was reduced to silence. At home, his wife Clementine watched him pace for hours, chain-smoking cigars, unable to sit still. "I am finished," he reportedly told her one night, staring into the fireplace. "I shall never rise again." For a man whose entire being revolved around action and conviction, inactivity was torture. The silence of disgrace was deafening. Churchill's mind began to unravel under the strain. He was plagued by what he called his black dog, a deep depression that had followed him since youth but now grew darker than ever. Yet even in despair, there was a stubborn spark in him. He refused to vanish quietly. "I must find a way to live," he wrote in his journal. "I cannot just fade away." It was then, in a moment of unexpected clarity, that he decided to do something unthinkable for a disgraced politician. He would go to war himself. If the generals and critics accused him of cowardice or arrogance, he would meet the enemy face to face. He would fight, not from an office, but in the trenches. When he informed Clementine of his decision, she was horrified. But Churchill was unmovable. He saw the battlefield as both penance and redemption. Soon he arranged to join the army as a lieutenant colonel on the Western Front. The man who had once commanded fleets would now lead a battalion of soldiers into the mud and blood of France as the train carried him toward the front lines. Churchill looked out the window at the bleak countryside and whispered to himself, "I have lost everything, except perhaps the chance to begin again." By January 1916, Winston Churchill arrived at Ploegsteert Wood, known to the soldiers as Plug Street, on the Western Front. The cold bit into his bones. The air stank of damp earth, oil, and decay. It was a far cry from the warm chambers of Whitehall. Here, the thunder of artillery replaced political debate, and rats scurried where once secretaries bustled. Churchill had exchanged the Admiralty for a trench. He commanded the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, a mix of veterans and young recruits. To them, he was not the fallen politician, but Colonel Churchill, a man who shared their misery, their fear, and their jokes. He lived among them in a dugout reinforced with sandbags, writing letters to Clementine by candlelight and sketching maps on the backs of envelopes. At night, the shell fire would rumble endlessly. "It is difficult to believe," he wrote, "that any trace of man's works will remain." Yet, even amid the horror, Churchill found a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, he was free from political intrigue. No headlines, no committees, no critics, just the stark simplicity of survival. "This is the best I can do now," he wrote, "to share the life of men who have no power, no title, no pretension." He was not reckless with his men. When the order came for pointless raids, he argued with higher command to spare lives. His soldiers respected him deeply, not for his speeches, but for his presence. They said he carried himself like a man with something to prove and something to atone for. Evenings in the trench, Churchill painted watercolors of the ruined landscape. The act soothed him. It was a small rebellion against despair. "I felt keenly," he said later, "that this was a man's work, to fight, to create, and to endure." And though he could not know it then, the lessons he learned in those muddy trenches, humility, endurance, and the courage to begin again, would one day prepare him for his greatest calling. By the time Churchill left the front in May 1916, the experience had changed him profoundly. The mud and fear of the trenches had stripped away the arrogance that once defined him. He had seen men die for inches of ground, watched courage turn to exhaustion, and realized that war was not the noble adventure he once imagined. It was a slow, grinding devourer of souls. When he returned to London, he was not the same man who had left. The corridors of Westminster seemed smaller, the debates pettier. He no longer spoke with the same brash certainty. "I was humbled," he would later write, "by the immensity of suffering and the futility of pride." But humility did not mean defeat. Beneath the surface of calm reflection, the fire still burned. Churchill began to study, obsessively. He spent hours poring over history, strategy, and economics. He read about past empires and their collapses, convinced that understanding failure was the first step to preventing it. "Every disaster," he told a friend, "is a lesson if one survives it." During this period, Churchill rediscovered his greatest weapon, his pen. He began to write about the war, the government, and his own mistakes. His essays were honest, sometimes brutally so. In one, he admitted, "I thought I could shape war with logic. But war is a beast that laughs at plans." Readers, even his critics, were struck by the honesty. Slowly, public opinion softened. He was no longer seen as the reckless warmonger. He was the man who had fallen and dared to reflect. His writings brought him income, but more importantly, they gave him a voice again. And as he filled page after page, the world outside continued to burn. The war that had ruined his career was not yet over, but in his private exile, Churchill was preparing for something greater than redemption. He was rebuilding his soul. When the Great War ended in 1918, Britain emerged victorious but broken, economically strained, politically divided, and haunted by loss. Churchill, who had re-entered the government in its final phase as Minister of Munitions, found himself once again near power, but the shadow of Gallipoli lingered. For some, he would always be the man who sent soldiers to die on those beaches. The 1920s would test him in new ways. Churchill switched political parties twice and gained a reputation as unpredictable. He served as Chancellor of the Exchequer, where his controversial decision to return Britain to the gold standard backfired disastrously, worsening unemployment. To his enemies, it confirmed that he was reckless and out of touch. To his allies, it showed courage, but little wisdom. Then, in 1929, the political tide turned sharply against him. The Conservatives lost power, and Churchill once again found himself cast out, this time not for scandal, but for being out of sync with the times. The 1930s would come to be known as his wilderness years, nearly a decade when he held no office, no influence, and few allies. But while others saw irrelevance, Churchill saw opportunity. He threw himself into writing history, The World, Crisis, Marlborough, and countless essays. These works were not just literature. They were a form of training. Each book was a study of power, leadership, and fate. Through the stories of others, he was sharpening his understanding of his own destiny. Yet the years of isolation were also years of deep personal doubt. Friends deserted him. Party leaders dismissed him as a relic of the past. Even his own family worried he was destroying his legacy. But Churchill remained defiant. "I'm ready to be cast into the wilderness," he said, "but I shall not give up my conviction." That conviction, that fascism was rising unchecked in Europe, would soon become the obsession that brought him back from obscurity. As Hitler's shadow stretched across Germany in the early 1930s, most of Britain looked the other way. The horrors of the First World War were still fresh, and the public wanted peace at any cost. Appeasement became the policy of the day. Compromise, negotiation, and hope that Hitler's ambitions would end at his borders. But Churchill saw something different. He studied Hitler's speeches, memorized his rhetoric, and read between the lines. To him, it was obvious Germany was rearming for war. Britain, he warned, was sleepwalking into disaster. His speeches in Parliament were fiery, relentless, and deeply unpopular. The press mocked him. Politicians rolled their eyes. One headline sneered, "Churchill again sees doom." But he refused to be silent. "You were given the choice between war and dishonor," he thundered after the Munich Agreement. "You chose dishonor, and you will have war." His words were prophetic, but at the time they earned him isolation. Once again, he was the lonely voice, the outcast, dismissed as a warmonger. Even his old allies in the Conservative Party turned their backs. He spent his evenings at Chartwell, his country home, surrounded by books, paintings, and memories of better days. But in those quiet hours, Churchill did not despair. "The truth," he said, "is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is." He continued to warn, to write, to shout into the storm, until, finally, the storm broke. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within days, Britain was once again at war. And suddenly, the man they had ridiculed for years, the prophet of doom, was the only one who had seen the truth all along. When the call came for Churchill to return to government, he did not gloat. He simply said, "I was right, but I take no joy in it." For him, vindication was a heavy burden, because he knew what lay ahead, the greatest test of his life. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The streets were silent that morning. No cheers, no flags, only the grim knowledge that another generation would be asked to die. Inside his home at Chartwell, Winston Churchill sat by the telephone, waiting. He was 64 years old, out of office for nearly a decade, and many in Parliament still considered him a liability. Yet he knew this was the moment history had been preparing him for. When the call finally came from Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, offering him the post of First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill's response was simple. "All my past life has been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." The Admiralty sent out a brief message to the fleet, one that would echo through history. "Winston is back." The Navy erupted with excitement. To the sailors who still remembered his leadership from 1914, it felt like a return of an old warrior. But Churchill was no longer the same man who had ordered the Dardanelles invasion. He had learned, through failure and exile, the weight of command. He demanded discipline, speed, and creativity, but he also listened. Still, the early months of war were grim. The German blitzkrieg tore through Poland and Scandinavia. The Royal Navy suffered losses at sea. Within months, the illusion of easy victory was gone. Churchill's energy was tireless, but even he could not mask the truth. Britain was unprepared for what was coming. Yet, when Denmark and Norway fell, and Hitler turned his gaze toward the West, it was not just armies that were tested. It was the will of nations. And soon, Churchill himself would face the greatest test of his political life: the fall of France. May 1940. Hitler's armies rolled into Belgium and France, and within weeks, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. Neville Chamberlain's government collapsed under the weight of panic and disillusionment. Britain needed a leader who could command unity and courage. On May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill was summoned to Buckingham Palace. King George VI asked him to form a government. Churchill accepted without hesitation. As he left the palace, he wrote later, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny." But the moment of destiny came with immense fear. The British army was surrounded, France was collapsing, and an invasion of Britain seemed imminent. Many within his own war cabinet believed peace with Germany was the only option. Some argued for negotiation through Italy. Churchill refused. "If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last," he said, "let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." He was not speaking for rhetoric. He meant it. Those who met him in those days remembered his eyes, weary, bloodshot, but burning with conviction. "You cannot reason with a tiger," he said, "when your head is in its mouth." He convinced his cabinet against all odds that Britain must fight on. The days that followed were chaos. German bombers darkened the skies over London. France begged for help. Dunkirk became a desperate evacuation. Yet Churchill saw in that moment not defeat, but resilience. "Wars are not won by evacuations," he admitted, but the courage of ordinary citizens and sailors who saved hundreds of thousands would soon become the foundation of his greatest speech. By June, France had fallen. Britain stood alone. But for the first time in years, Churchill felt calm. He knew what must be done, not to win yet, but to endure. The early months of 1940 were a strange mixture of tension and illusion. Britain was technically at war, but the guns had gone silent. The press called it the phony war, and for Churchill, now back in government as First Lord of the Admiralty, it was a period of restless waiting. He pushed the Admiralty to prepare for the worst, inspecting naval bases, demanding reports, and warning anyone who would listen that Germany was merely gathering strength. His colleagues, still haunted by the losses of the Great War, clung to the illusion that diplomacy or distance could protect them from catastrophe. But Churchill, haunted by history, saw through the calm. "This is only the lull before the hurricane," he told a friend. When Hitler invaded Norway in April 1940, Churchill's warnings were suddenly vindicated, but the campaign turned into chaos. The British operation, hastily planned and poorly executed, was riddled with confusion and blunders. The failure of the Norwegian campaign, which Churchill had championed, became a political weapon for his opponents. For a moment, it seemed his career might once again be consumed by the very forces of misjudgment and distrust he had spent years trying to overcome. The fallout was swift. Neville Chamberlain's government, already fragile, was rocked by a wave of public anger. Members of Parliament, including some from his own party, demanded accountability. Churchill found himself in an impossible position, forced to defend policies that he had influenced but not fully controlled, while knowing that his own political survival hung in the balance. In private, he was furious with the incompetence he had witnessed, yet publicly he stood by the government, refusing to betray his colleagues even as they began to distance themselves from him. Then came the debate in the House of Commons, a storm of voices that would decide the fate of the government and, in many ways, the course of the war. As Churchill listened from the front bench, his emotions clashed violently. The opposition's anger was justified, yet he feared that the collapse of the government would hand Britain to men unprepared for the fight that was coming. He defended the Admiralty with vigor, his words cutting through the chamber like steel, but the damage was done. Chamberlain's credibility crumbled, and a vote of confidence left his majority hanging by a thread. It was one of those moments where history seems to hold its breath. The government was falling apart, the nation was leaderless, and the storm Churchill had predicted for years was about to break over Britain. Yet, as chaos loomed, something remarkable began to stir within him. The humiliation of Gallipoli, the years in the wilderness, the ridicule of his warnings, all of it had forged a resilience that no defeat could crush. He had been preparing for this crisis his entire life, even if he didn't yet know it. In the days that followed, while London buzzed with political intrigue, Churchill waited in anxious silence. He walked through the Admiralty's corridors, smoking heavily, reading reports late into the night. To the sailors and staff who passed him, he looked restless but determined, as though he were waiting for a signal only he could recognize. The weight of decades pressed down on him, the failures, the mockery, the isolation, but beneath it all, the fire of purpose burned brighter than ever. When Chamberlain finally resigned and the king sent for Churchill, the nation stood on the edge of destruction. Hitler's armies were rolling through Europe and France was days away from collapse. Yet, in that darkest hour, the man who had been cast aside, scorned, and nearly destroyed by his own misjudgments was about to step into history's harshest light. His greatest defeat had prepared him for the impossible task ahead. It was the cruel logic of destiny. Only a man who had lost everything could lead a people who were about to risk it all. On May 10, 1940, as the thunder of German bombs echoed over Europe, Winston Churchill entered 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister. The day he had dreamed of and feared had come at the worst possible moment. The fall of Norway had toppled Chamberlain, France was collapsing, and Hitler's armies were unstoppable. Britain stood utterly alone. As he sat in the study once occupied by his predecessors, Churchill understood that he was inheriting not power, but catastrophe. The phone rang with bad news every hour, and each new report from the front was darker than the last. Yet instead of despair, he felt an almost supernatural calm. For the first time in decades, the country's fate was tied to his conviction, and that gave him purpose. That first night, he wrote in his diary, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." It was not arrogance, but a recognition of the cruel symmetry of his journey. Every failure, every humiliation had taught him how to endure this moment. Now, as France's defenses crumbled and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, Churchill turned to the one weapon he still commanded: words. His speeches, raw and defiant, became a rallying cry for a terrified nation. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," he declared to Parliament. It was not comfort he offered the people, but courage, the truth that survival would demand sacrifice beyond imagination. Yet, beneath the public bravado, Churchill wrestled with despair. His war cabinet was divided. Some still favored peace talks with Germany, believing Britain could not withstand the storm. Lord Halifax, calm and persuasive, argued that continuing the fight was suicide. But Churchill refused to yield. He remembered too vividly the lessons of appeasement, the cost of underestimating tyranny. In long, smoky meetings that stretched past midnight, he fought to keep Britain's spirit unbroken. "If this Long Island story of ours is to end," he said quietly, "let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." The words silenced the room. It was not rhetoric, it was resolve. Outside, Londoners were bracing for what felt like the end of civilization. Blackout curtains covered every window. Families carried gas masks as casually as umbrellas. Air raid sirens wailed in the night, and entire neighborhoods vanished under German bombs. Yet, amid the ruin, something remarkable began to happen. The British people hardened. The defiance of their prime minister became their own. They refused to break, even as the world crumbled around them. But Churchill's fight was not only against Hitler, it was against time, fatigue, and the ghosts of his own past. Every decision weighed heavily on him. The evacuation of Dunkirk tested his soul. Watching the British army cornered on French beaches, he faced the nightmare of losing everything in one blow. And yet, through a miracle of courage and chaos, more than 300,000 men were rescued. It was, he said, a deliverance by the grace of God. But even as the nation rejoiced, Churchill knew it was only a reprieve. The real war was just beginning. Leadership, Churchill soon discovered, was a kind of isolation. The cheers that greeted his speeches could not drown out the doubts that haunted him at night. He slept little, pacing the halls of Downing Street or sitting in the map room, staring at maps covered in red pins marking enemy advances. Each morning brought a new disaster. A convoy sunk, a city bombed, an ally lost. He carried the burden of every casualty as if it were his own doing, yet he refused to let despair show. "You must look like the victor," he told his aides, even when he felt utterly defeated inside. His wife, Clementine, was one of the few who saw through the facade. She worried for him, not just his safety but his spirit. He was drinking more, smoking endlessly, and working through the night. "You are not a young man anymore," she told him gently in a letter. But Churchill brushed it off. The war demanded everything, even his health. "I cannot stop until the work is done," he said. The truth was, he feared that if he ever paused, the weight of it all would crush him. Despite the tension, his leadership began to transform the government. Gone was the hesitation of Chamberlain's administration. Churchill demanded speed, innovation, and daring. He surrounded himself with unconventional minds, scientists, strategists, even eccentric inventors, anyone who could find a way to outthink the enemy. He pushed for radar technology, supported covert operations, and encouraged the Special Operations Executive to set Europe ablaze. His energy was relentless, but it came at a cost. Every loss, every failure struck him like a personal wound. As the Blitz tore through London, Churchill made it a point to walk among the rubble, comforting survivors. Cameras captured him standing in the smoking ruins of homes, his hat pulled low, his face grim but unyielding. These visits were not staged. They were his way of sharing the people's pain. "He looked like one of us," a woman said after meeting him in the aftermath of a bombing. Tired, angry, but not beaten. It was in those moments that the bond between leader and people was sealed, an unspoken pact of endurance. Yet, behind the courage, there was still guilt. He knew his decisions meant death for many. Orders to bomb German cities, to hold positions that could not be held, to send young men into hopeless fights, all of it weighed on him. In his private notes, he sometimes questioned his own soul. "Are we justified?" he wrote one night, "or merely desperate?" But in the end, he always returned to the same conclusion. Surrender was not an option. As long as he breathed, Britain would fight. By 1942, the war had entered a new phase. The United States had joined the fight, and the tide was slowly turning. For Churchill, it was a moment of vindication and exhaustion. He had carried the nation through its darkest nights, but the strain was showing. His once booming voice was hoarse, his gait slower. Yet his will remained unbroken. When he crossed the Atlantic to meet Roosevelt, he did so not as a desperate man begging for help, but as a partner in a shared crusade. Together, the two leaders planned the path to victory, though it was still far away. The alliance with Roosevelt gave Churchill hope, but also introduced new challenges. The Americans were powerful, confident, and sometimes dismissive of British caution. Churchill had to balance pride with pragmatism. He charmed Roosevelt, argued with generals, and clung fiercely to Britain's influence. He knew the future of the empire was slipping away, but for now, the only goal was survival. "We shall not fail or falter," he told Parliament. "We shall not weaken or tire. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." At home, his popularity soared. The man once mocked as a reckless warmonger was now a symbol of defiance. But even in triumph, Churchill sensed the loneliness that comes with power. He had become larger than life, an icon rather than a man. Friends whispered that he was changing, that the fire that had once fueled his greatness now consumed him. The same traits that had made him indispensable in war, stubbornness, defiance, intensity, would soon make him difficult to live with in peace. Still, there were moments of quiet pride. In the winter of 1942, after news arrived of British victories in North Africa, Churchill allowed himself a rare smile. "This is not the end," he told the nation, "but it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." The phrase captured what everyone felt, a weary but growing hope. For the first time, it seemed possible that Britain might survive. Yet Churchill knew better than most that victory had its own burdens. The longer the war dragged on, the more fragile alliances became, and the more restless his country grew. Britain had endured so much, and the people were desperate for peace. But Churchill, haunted by his old ghosts of failure, knew that the final act of any war was often the hardest. He had led Britain through the storm, but what awaited him when the guns fell silent would test him in ways even defeat never had. By 1944, the world was beginning to glimpse the outlines of victory. The Allied landings in Normandy had opened the long-awaited Second Front, and the German army was in retreat across Europe. For Churchill, it was both triumph and torment. The very victory he had fought so fiercely to achieve was now revealing its terrible price. British cities lay in ruins, the empire was broke, and millions were dead. Each success on the battlefield was shadowed by grief at home. Londoners cheered. The news from France, but Churchill could see in their faces the weariness of a nation that had given everything. At cabinet meetings, he sometimes sat in silence, lost in thought as his ministers discussed post-war reconstruction. The future no longer belonged to men like him. The Americans and Soviets were now the dominant powers, and Britain's role was diminishing. He hid his unease behind his trademark humor, cracking jokes even as he sensed that the sun was setting on the empire he had devoted his life to defending. "We are no longer the great lion," he confided to an aide. "We are the old lion, still dangerous, but tired." The strain of leadership was also taking a toll on his health. Years of late nights, cigars, and brandy had left him frail. His doctor warned of heart trouble, urging him to rest, but rest was something Churchill could not allow himself. He feared that without the war, without purpose, he would crumble. And so he pressed on, dictating memos from bed, reading reports until dawn, his mind still alive with strategy. "The price of greatness," he once said, "is responsibility." But privately, he wondered if that price had become too high. When the news of D-Day's success reached him, Churchill allowed himself only a moment's satisfaction before the anxiety returned. He knew the blood cost that lay ahead. "This is only the beginning," he said grimly to his generals. The thought of so many young men dying on the beaches tore at him. Yet he believed deeply that every sacrifice was necessary to end the tyranny that had consumed Europe. In his darker moments, he would whisper to himself, "It had to be done." There was no other way. Victory was near, but Churchill began to sense a growing distance between himself and the public he had once so inspired. The people still admired him, but they were tired of war. They dreamed of peace, of rebuilding, of a gentler future. Churchill, still haunted by the fight, could not share their vision. For him, war had been life itself, the crucible in which his destiny had burned. As peace approached, he found himself staring into an unfamiliar emptiness. When Germany, finally, surrendered in May 1945, the celebrations erupted across Britain. Crowds flooded Trafalgar Square, waving flags, singing, weeping. For the first time in 6 long years, the air was filled not with sirens, but with joy. Churchill stood on the balcony of the Ministry of Health, flashing his famous V for Victory sign to a roaring crowd below. It was the image the world had waited for, the man who had defied Hitler standing triumphant at last. Yet as he looked over the jubilant sea of faces, Churchill felt an ache of loneliness he could not explain. The war was over, but so too was his purpose. He had lived for this struggle, sustained by the fire of resistance. Now, with victory achieved, that fire had nowhere to burn. Britain faced not glory but ruin, rationing, debt, and exhaustion. The people adored their wartime leader, but they wanted a new kind of future, one built on welfare and reform, not imperial grandeur. And so, just months after leading Britain to victory, Churchill faced an election he could not win. The campaign was brutal. Clement Attlee, calm and understated, represented a different kind of hope. Churchill's speeches, full of warnings about socialism and tyranny, felt out of place in a country longing for peace. He was fighting the wrong war. When the results came in, the defeat was devastating. The man who had saved Britain was voted out of office in a landslide. Churchill took the news with his usual stoic humor, telling friends, "They have a perfect right to kick me out. After all, they have been through a lot." But in private, the loss broke him. That night, as the crowds cheered a new government, Churchill sat alone with a cigar and a glass of whiskey, staring into the fire. "I have been dismissed," he murmured half to himself. The silence of peace felt unbearable. Without war, he was adrift, a lion without a battle. For decades, his entire identity had been forged in the furnace of conflict. Now, the quiet threatened to consume him. He took refuge in painting and writing, retreating to his beloved Chartwell estate. But, even surrounded by the beauty of the countryside, he could not escape the sense of fading relevance. The world he had shaped was moving on without him. His speeches no longer stirred nations. His advice was politely ignored. And yet, in the solitude of his study, he continued to write, his memoirs, his histories, trying to capture the meaning of it all. In the twilight of his life, Winston Churchill often reflected on the strange paradox of his destiny. He had won the war, but lost the peace. The empire he had fought to preserve was dissolving. India was independent, colonies were slipping away, and Britain's global influence had shrunk to a shadow of its former self. "I have achieved much," he said once, "but not what I set out to do." His triumph had been absolute, and yet incomplete. Still, his legacy endured. When he returned to power in 1951, older and slower but still formidable, he ruled a nation transformed. The Britain he led was no longer the one that had stood alone in 1940. It was weary, rebuilding, uncertain of its place in the New World Order. Churchill himself was no longer the fiery orator of his youth. His speeches were softer now, his humor tinged with melancholy. Yet the world still listened when he spoke. His voice, gravelly and deliberate, carried the authority of a man who had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. In those final years, Churchill often gazed at the paintings he had created, landscapes bathed in light, tranquil and still. They were, perhaps, his way of finding peace with the chaos he had lived through. Friends said that in his garden, among the roses and goldfish ponds, he seemed content at last. But when asked if he missed power, he smiled faintly. "Every day," he said, "but I do not miss the burden." He died in 1965 at the age of 90, his passing marked by silence across the world. Leaders and soldiers, old and young, paused to remember the man who had carried civilization on his shoulders. His funeral was one of the largest in history, with rivers of mourners lining the streets. As his coffin was borne down the Thames, cranes dipped in salute, the same cranes that had once loaded weapons of war. Winston Churchill's story is not simply one of victory. It is the story of a man who bore the unbearable, who turned his flaws into strength and his defiance into destiny. He was stubborn, flawed, brilliant, and utterly human. His greatness lay not in perfection, but in perseverance. For, in the end, Churchill taught the world that courage is not the absence of fear, but the resolve to stand firm when there is no reason to believe you can win. And when the darkness comes again, as it always does, it is his voice that still echoes through history. We shall never surrender.